what I want to say is that I've noticed some people, as it were, want to use the abolition of man in the culture wars. And they want to use it to beat over the head, transgender people, transhumanists, redefinitions of marriage and all the rest of it. And I understand why they want to do that, because those things deserve to be tackled. But the thing that Lewis puts his finger on, especially in that hideous strength, and he refers to it a couple of times in The Abolition of Man as well, is something that Christians don't like to talk about, and that is contraception.
Sure, yeah. We did a whole issue with it.
And which of us has ever heard a sermon preaching against the evils of contraception? Have you? Have I? I've never.
We don't hear them. No.
I've been a Christian all my life. I've been going to church services for 56 years. Never once have I heard the word even uttered, let alone used as a theme of a sermon.
Right.
And yet, C.S. Lewis, especially in that hideous strength, fastens upon it as an emblem of this new might is right, willpower kind of self-determination. You quoted that bit about, the cardinal problem for the wise men of old was how to conform the soul to reality, and the solution had been wisdom, self-control, virtue. For the modern person, it's a technique. Well, what is contraception but a technique? Whereas in the olden days, you would have had to use wisdom, virtue, and self-control.
Right. Yeah, that's so true.
So I think if before we start hitting other people over the head, we ought to hit ourselves over the head as Christians and ask, have we actually been getting this wrong? And indeed, has that mistake led to these other mistakes?
Well, as Americans, we're particularly guilty of this of pragmatism. That's kind of our that's the philosophy that just has its roots in our own soil. It's obviously...
And pragmatometry, remember, is the thing that Lewis satirizes in that hideous thing.
Right. So, and we see it even in ministerial circles. So, out of Fuller Theological Seminary in the late 70s, early 80s, the church growth movement, what was it? It was applied science. It was an attempt to try to find the techniques to get churches to grow.
But exactly the opposite direction of having children and families.
It was more about...
If you want organic church growth, there's an obvious way to do it.
That's. I don't remember a chapter in any of the church growth books that I remember reading back in those days that referred to that.
The other problem is a kind of radical biblicism that says I can't point to a verse in Scripture that says you can't use contraception. Of course, evangelicals also early on didn't have a problem with abortion. It's something they often conveniently forget because there's no verse that they could point to directly that addressed the subject.
I actually remember Bill Clinton making that point in the 90s, that when he was a young Christian in the United States, he had he had Baptist pastors that said there was no problem with it.
I think, actually, I might be wrong about this, and if I am, I apologize, but I think Norm Geisler originally didn't have a problem with it.
I'm not surprised. Well, there's a long set of things that Christians have endorsed that we regret endorsing.
But it's that kind of radical biblicism that poses the problem, because we don't think through the implications of it in an adequate way to understand why contraception is wrong, or even earlier, why abortion is wrong.
Yeah, quite.
So in the American ecclesial environment, leadership development and so forth, the first thing we turn to when it comes to evangelism is technique. It's all about technique. Failing to conform our souls to reality. And that's, so I'm just that's a whole other conversation, but that's a sore spot for me, but I think there's a tie-in here.
There is.
Well, quick, what year, remind me the year The Abolition of Man was written.
1943.
And this was right around the time of the decision at Lambeth, is that?
Well,
the Lambeth decision was 1933.
Sorry.
It was 1930.
33, okay, but it started probably already to trickle.
But even at Lambeth, there were strict restrictions on when contraception was legitimate. But once the camel got its nose under the tent,
it started.
The rest of it followed.
Yeah. But So I think Lewis paid attention to the 1930 Lambeth decision.
Yeah.
And his first public objection to contraception you find in 1933 in the Pilgrim's Regress. Anyway, the reason I'm chuntering on about this is because I've just written an article on the theme of contraception in That Hideous Strength, which is going to come out in a book of essays called Life on the Silent Planet.
Oh, wow.
Edited by Rhys Laverty of the Davenant Institute.
Oh, I know the Davenant guys.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. So mine is just one of 20 or so essays in this book.
Well, that's a marvelous title for a book. We need to do a conference on that title.
But I don't expect to make any friends in talking about this thing, right? Because it's a deeply, deeply unpopular thing to talk about in every circle.
Yeah. But I do hear it come up more and more to encourage you. It's not something that is well. I touched on did an entire issue on it here not too long ago.
Yes, and I learnt a lot from reading that issue. Not least that Charles Gore, who was Bishop here of Oxford, the Anglican Bishop of Oxford, was one of the few Anglican figures who stood out against the revisionist decision at Lambeth and wrote a fiery pamphlet saying, of course, contraception is wrong. And as it happens, Lewis admired Gore and read a lot of his books and recommends them frequently. So I suspect he read that pamphlet as well.
Right. Yeah, this is a side of, I would have assumed Lewis would have been on these, the sides of it, but you opening that up, that opens up a whole lot of Lewis, in particular this argument here. And I think as for Christians, it's so significant because as we try to hammer out in a new context where a lot of things have been lost to Christian memory about what the human is, right? As they said, similar to the fireball, when you understand what it is and how connected it is to the procreative and the image of God, in that sense, is this kind of rich resource is something clearly for us, and that was insightful to point that to the contraceptive issue.
Yeah, well, it's actually critical because if memory serves, Merlin basically says because Jane and Mark did not conceive the child at the proper time, the one who is to deliver Britain from all of this nonsense will not be born. I mean, it had almost literally apocalyptic consequences.
At least in Merlin's view.
In Merlin's view.
As Ransom actually contradicts Merlin and says the child may yet be born.
But Merlin says, well, the time's passed.
Yeah.
So
but Ransom seems to know better than Merlin.
But it's serious. Is the point?
Yes, absolutely.